Do you have any questions before we start?
No, sir.
You're good? Okay. Yeah, definitely want to end with that, since that ties in well with Homer, the Greek alphabet, which leads well into, when we get into Rome, they use that for the Latin alphabet. And as I also mentioned, the Greek alphabet, or the Greek language, is really preserved well into the modern day. And as we're going to see in the next chapter, yeah, because we talked about Alexander the Great, that's actually how we end up with the how we end up translating the Rosetta Stone. So I don't know. It's super cool that like that just stuck around so long. And again, a large part of why we do have more people. A large part of why, hey folks.
Malfunction.
Y'all are good. Welcome to class. A large part of why, we have the Iliad and the Odyssey as like these major stories that most people know. I mean, even if you haven't sat down and read them, if you were to have them told to you, or if you were to sit and read them, you might realize, oh wait, I have heard this before, or I've at least heard this in some form before. Because I think the first time I actually like sat and absorbed it, I guess would be the best way to put it, way back in the day when I was young, back when PBS was more of a thing. Do any of you guys know Wishbone? The little dog, and he would it was basically an excuse to turn books into like a show, but with a little adorable dog as like the main character. And most of what I remember was like Robin Hood stories, but I remember the Odyssey being one, and it was wild, like watching a dog be Odysseus. But then like, I mean, I was very young watching that. But then like later on, I heard other, because like the Odyssey is huge. There's so many different, like you could hear just like one story from the Odyssey, and that be enough to be a full story. Like just Odysseus and Polyphemus, I believe, the name of the Cyclops, where he and his men are trapped on the island, and the Cyclops asks his name, and he tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody, and the Cyclops, each day the Cyclops reaches down and takes one of his men to eat him, and so at one point the Odysseus and his men like fashion together a spear and stab the Cyclops' eye out, and then they hide under the bottom of sheep so that when the Cyclops reaches down to try to find them, he only feels the top of the sheep, and when the sheep go out to graze, they're able to escape. And when the Cyclops cries out to his friends that he's been stabbed, that he's been blinded, and they say, well, who did this to you? And he says, it was nobody. They said, well, okay. A lot of Odysseus' stories are more like mind over might, as opposed to like, the stories of Hercules, where it's just some like dude breaking stuff because he's huge. So that's what a lot of that was. So you'll sometimes hear stories of Odysseus, be like, wait, I've heard this same idea before. It's just because Odysseus is so old, or the Odyssey is so old, that those same patterns have been used in later stories. Anyway, moving on to newer stuff. Well, newer for us, I guess. It's still the Archaic Age in Greece. So this is still technically the Greek Dark Ages, but we're starting to gradually pull ourselves into a revitalization of Greek culture. We're starting to get culture, government, religion, and economy again. But there's still tension between the city-states and within the city-states. The polis, I should say. Those who had power wanted more power, and those without power, which is to say, most of the people, were not too happy with this. So in order to avoid all-out war or all-out revolution from within the polis, there were ways of resolving this. You had the Olympic Games, increased importance of religious authority, and tyrants, which back then wasn't necessarily a bad thing, which I will get into. This is literally like the opening paragraph in the book of the Archaic Age, so this is just kind of an intro for that. So yeah, the Archaic Age, just kind of the tail end of the Dark Ages, as things are getting a little bit better. We're not quite, golden age of Greece just yet, but things are becoming better for Greece. So we have here, so you've got city-states, you've got Athens, you've got Corinth, you've got Argos. Notice no Sparta yet. I mean, you've got where Sparta would be, but they're a late player in Greece. So they actually didn't exist yet. You got just like tribal organizations out this way. So when I say mainland Greece, I mean just this little section. Then you've got some areas out here and out in the islands. Delos, for example, Delos was very important. Crete. And these areas here, this is Ionia, which we'll talk more about later. But this is also part of like the Greek world. Lesbos, for example. And then, of course, Macedonia, but we'll also get to that later. But like from this area down is mostly what we'll be talking about. But for right now, it's just this small area here. So, I guess technically this only happens once every 4 years, but hey, we're going to talk about the Olympic Games on a year that the Olympic Games actually fell. Excuse me. Oh. So, the Olympic Games. This was the first fixed date in Greek history, 776 BCE. Again, while I could definitely have you guys remember this date, but don't worry about it. This is the first real, for sure date we have for Greek history. This is when a bunch of different Greek polis came together and had a festival in Olympia, which is down in southern Greece, or Peloponnesus being the landmass where Sparta is located, but this is north of Sparta. Pan-Hellenic means all Greek. Hellenic means Greek. We're going to be seeing a lot of that, by the way. So that's another little Greek word I guess you guys should keep in mind. This was made to honor the gods, in particular Zeus, because, he was the head guy in charge. Held every 4 years. Something else we have kept. We have kept as tradition. So athletes from all over Greece would come together, representing their polis. This was a way for the various Greek powers to compete without actually going to war. And especially during the Cold War, that was very much what the Olympics were. Especially like in the 70s and 80s, the Olympics were really, really serious between, the United States and the USSR. Like, it was a real big deal who won the freaking ice skating Olympics. There were some really freaking heated Olympics back during the Cold War. So the Greek Olympics combined the idea of individual excellence, known as arete, and the belief that life was a constant struggle or competition, known as agon. Hey, look, there are some Greek words you guys should maybe know. And again, don't worry about it. That is multiple choice. It's just that's easy questions for me to throw in to get a nice even 50 by the end of it. So arete is your individual excellence. You are the best version of yourself. And just the overall competition is the idea of agon. Also, I should note, just for everybody, including, actually, let me make sure real quick before I get any further, because I nearly peed my pants last time. Make sure my mic, okay. Sometimes the mic switches over to another source, and then my mic's not working. And I was like 45 minutes into the previous class before I thought to check, but thankfully it was working. Anyway. Yeah, so anyway, what I was going to say is this first test, particularly in this class, this first test will probably be the most difficult just because in terms of material, it's the most broad. Because, like, just the first chapter was broad. I mean, it was like, here's some cave paintings, and here's Mesopotamia, and here's Egypt, and, like, also here's just some, like, a couple of Bronze Age places. And then the next chapter, here's Greece, which is in itself a bunch of different stuff. And then the next chapter is, like, Alexander the Great, which is technically just more Greece, but it's beyond that. So the first test is going to be a little bit broad, and a lot of times people don't do as well as they'd like to on the first test. But after that, the material's a lot more concise. Like chapters 4, 5, and 6 are Rome, Rome, and Rome. It's much more concise. It's early Rome, mid-Rome, and like the fall of Rome. And then 7, 8, and 9 are Middle Ages, Middle Ages, Middle Ages. So in previous classes, I've always seen people have a little issue with this first part. I mean, even me, when I'm like putting the test together, it's harder to keep all that together timeline-wise. But for later stuff, it flows better. It's just as hard because the further you go back, the harder it is to like keep things concise. Just wanted to let you guys know in advance. Anyway, here is the first Olympic Games since Greece was reunified. So that's like 1912, maybe? But that's like, the original, shoot, what was it called? Hippodrome. Yeah, that was their racetrack. I mean, technically, hippodrome is the Latin term because that's the, what the, what was hippodrome Greek? I can't remember. Anyway, on to the religious aspects of Greece, because again, despite each of the polis being very different, they all did share the same religion. Now, granted, each different polis had like different gods that they revered, more strongly than others. Obviously, like Athens had Athena, but they still had the same pantheon. So we had the Oracle of Delphi, was dedicated to the god Apollo, Apollo being the god of divination? He could see into the future. So, that's the one you want to talk to about stuff. This was the way for them to commune with their gods. So they would often come together and speak to the oracle about their problems rather than having it out on the battlefield. So the oracle would speak for the gods and help them mediate their disputes. That said, it was usually used after the fact to justify actions rather than ask what the decision should be. So rather than two groups coming together and being like, hey, we both want this bit of land, who should get it? It's, hey, we took this bit of land from this group. And the other group's there like, yeah, they took this bit of land from us. What do the gods think about it? And the oracle would like pour this this stuff out and get high as fuck and speak for the gods, and would tell them either the gods were pleased with one side taking land from the other or displeased, and then the two groups would go from there. So yeah, it was a good time was had by all. Whether they took the oracle's advice or not was up to them, but by and large, they would at least respect what she had to say. All right. So this wasn't really in the intro, but it's important for what's coming up. And I kind of showed it in the previous map, but the map that I've got here in the book shows that they were far more widespread than that. So we've got Greek immigration with an E. So during this archaic age, the economy had stabilized enough that the Greeks began sending out. I don't want to use the same language I was using with the Europeans going to North America, but where they were sending out ships and setting up settlements all around the Mediterranean, which for the most part they had an idea of where stuff was already. The people living in the Mediterranean pretty much had an idea of where stuff was. But these weren't colonies. If Athens sent out a ship to set up a settlement, it wasn't New Athens, like all the freaking Europeans just knew whatever. It was its own. Well, I'll go ahead and bring up the last one. It was its own political entity. Now, it would usually carry traditions and often like political affiliation from the city that it left from. So if it left from Athens, it would usually carry Athenian democracy, which we'll talk about in greater detail later. But it wasn't under the control of Athens. It wasn't spreading Athenian power across, the Aegean Sea. If somebody left from, Corinth, same thing. It wasn't spreading the Corinthian empire. They were setting up a new city to do their own thing. Their buildings may have the Corinthian style, because the Corinthians, they had their own like style of pillars and whatnot. But they were their own thing. Like, it wasn't like, as I've said with 101, the French and the English and the Spanish coming over, and whatever they set up was directly linked back to their home countries. So yeah, it took, when I was first putting this together, years back now, it took me a minute to really like wrap my head around this, because I'm so used to the idea of European colonization, of wherever they're landing, they're claiming it for their homeland. But with this, it's just like, no, this is our new place where we live, and we're doing our own thing. Much like we saw with Phoenicia and Carthage. Like, once Phoenicia fell, Carthage is like, well, we're in our own thing now. And to show you just how far Greece spread, here's the map, which this shows a bunch of other places. But again, here's Phoenicia, which began their own colonization. So anything red is Phoenician. So again, here's Carthage here. And now, granted, they weren't all independent. That was kind of one big empire. Greece, again, each of their little city-states kind of was their own thing. So it's not like this was all one big interconnected region, but this just sort of showed the spread of their culture. It was just all on the coast here. This is going to become an issue. It's moving west, west. Dacians, Aenians, Thrace. Yeah, there we go. The Etruscans. We'll talk about them later too. But yeah, so this just shows. I mean, the Greeks were out here in southern Italy, which we'll actually talk about when we talk about Rome as well. Even over here in southern Spain, southern France. So they were all over the place, even northern Africa, even up some down here in Egypt. So they were all over the place. But again, not spreading like an empire, not like with Phoenicia, where this was all a connected group. Once they set up a city, they were their own thing. They were Greek culturally, but it's not like, if these guys came from Athens, they were spreading the Athenian Empire, which is a thing later. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about Hesiod. I honestly don't remember if he's even on the test. I really should go back and find out if he is, and if he's not, I should just take this slide out. But here's Hesiod. I kept accidentally bringing him up when I was talking about Herodotus. Um, he talked about the suffering of the common man through his poems Theogony, with the Greek gods, and Works and Days, with farming and the seasons. Um, because if you know anything about the Greek pantheon, the Greek gods are jerks. You know, they treat humans like playthings. Like, let's see how we can mess with the humans today. He complained about corruption, believed hard workers should rule the world, not cheating rich men. He's a little base for that. Much land was held by few people, polis becoming more aggressive towards each other. He was concerned with, all the land and all the power going to just a few, and then these cities having their poor killing each other on the battlefield. Boy, that sounds familiar. So while all the things we talked about before, immigration, the Oracle, the Olympic Games, and all of that, had helped to ease tensions somewhat, there were still people who were at the bottom rung and had basically nothing, despite them doing all of the work for the cities. And the people at the top who were doing basically nothing had all the power and money. And turns out at no point in history did people like that. So Hesiod had a number of quotes here. A bad neighbor is as great a calamity as a good one is a great advantage. I don't know if he necessarily means like an individual person or a family, or like the nearby polis, because it could be both. This one's kind of interesting. Gossip is mischievous, light and easy to raise, but grievous to bear and hard to get rid of. No gossip ever dies away entirely. If many people voice it, it too is a kind of divinity. Which, interestingly enough, the word itself has changed actually really quickly since it was first created thanks to the internet, which in itself is sort of a way the word works. The word meme was meant to be like a mental gene. It will be passed among people, and basically it would be something that would be alive, but only in a mental sense. And that's what he was describing here with gossip. Is once something is big enough, once an idea is big enough, you can't get rid of it, even if it's not true. Boy, that's true. And I forget who it was that invented the word meme. I should know it. He's relatively famous. And then, of course, that just became, haha, funny pictures on the internet. But even the word being corrupted on the internet and becoming something completely different is in itself a use of the word meme, because now we think of it as something entirely different. In fact, a lot of words that we think of today as something completely different have been changed due to cultural impact, like Nimrod. If you even know at all what that is. Usually if you hear that, if someone calls someone else a Nimrod, it's like, oh, you're calling someone an idiot. That's because that's the word Bugs Bunny used to insult Elmer Fudd. But actually, Nimrod was a great hunter in biblical stories, and he called Elmer Fudd that sarcastically because Elmer Fudd was supposed to be a hunter and wasn't so good at it. But because of the way he called him Nimrod, over the years the word itself evolved, and that's how we hear it now. So literally Bugs Bunny changed how we hear words. Culture itself changes how we use language. And I know we're talking about Greece, but Greece is actually a really good starting place for stuff like that. This isn't a great quote to use right now in a class of 3 people that are all women, but hey Hesiod, you're not doing so well. According to Hesiod, whoever has trusted a woman has trusted deceivers. Wow. Hesiod's been hurt. Or either his mother was really mean to him, I don't know. Anyway, on to tyrants. So, much like the word dictator, which we'll talk about when we get to Rome, much like the word Nimrod, or the name Nimrod, this has been changed over the years to mean something entirely negative, when in the Greek days it really wasn't. These were autocrats who seized power by force, which again, typically is a bad thing. But back then, this was typically good. They brought change to a polis. This was usually when the polis was beset by 2 feuding families. They were on the verge of nearly destroying the entire city. So instead, a dude with a lot of charisma and military power would come in, kick both of them out, and create a new system of government for the polis. And also, since they were charismatic individuals, they rarely had a successor, so they typically didn't set up a dynastic line. So it wasn't an easily corruptible system they set up. Not necessarily setting up a democracy. Again, that was something very rare. It was something in Athens, and also it was very different from modern-day democracy. We'll talk about that later. But it was enough of a change from literally people killing each other in the streets that people were happy with this dude coming in and changing things. Again, very rarely long-lasting. It was just a dude coming in and wiping the board clean, and a step to a different form of government. And, I mean, as I said before, it was usually a step from entrenched aristocratic rule to something else. This was very rarely something that stuck around. As I said, it wasn't something dynastic where you would have a tyrant and then his son would come in after him and then his son's son and on and on and on. It was one dude that would kick out the aristocrats because they were not doing a very good job, and then they would set up something later, usually like, say, a council of elders. I mean, even an oligarchy, just something that wasn't aristocrats that were killing each other in the streets, that was not at all helping people keep the city running. So yeah, that was the Greek tyrants, and I mean it was a sledgehammer system, but it got things done. And like I said, we'll talk about dictators in Rome, which is sort of like this, but actually more controlled, and not what we think of dictators today. So we'll get to that in a couple of PowerPoints. All right. Oh no, I'm not. I'm going to say I thought I was getting behind in the book, but I'm not. Okay. So yeah, all you really need to know about tyrants is they're the ones that, would come in, kick out the old system, usher in a new system, and they usually they wouldn't step down, but like considering the life expectancy then was like 30 or 40, they could stick around a few years. People weren't that bothered. And heck, a lot of them would step down. They come in and because they were usually also a citizen of that polis, and they were like, we want to fix this place, go in and kick the guys out and set something up and be like, all right, I'm done. Not always, but sometimes. Okay. Again, this is a really long chapter, so I'm going to try to get through it. Let's discuss a little bit more about the various types of, how a government worked in a polis. So, as I said, each polis had its own separate form of government due to the isolation of the Dark Age. And politically, a polis was three separate things. You had its built-up physical place, so that was the agora, or the agora and the Acropolis. So the marketplace and the high area in the middle. So the territory, so the city itself and the outlying lands where you got all the crops from. And then finally, the political community. So you needed the actual, politics of the region to form the polis. So you had the city, the lands, and the politics. So the physical city, the territory around it, and the politics of the city. That's what a polis was. So yes, I've described a polis twice now, one in the two things that made the physical polis, and now we're describing a polis as a political thing. So if I ask what a polis is, I'm going to give you three separate things, then I'm talking about this one. If I do, that's usually going to be the next credit. Okay. So some polis had some level of democracy, not a great deal, but a little bit. Athens, Kos, and Naxos, for example. Commoner assemblies, basically people would come together and they would raise their hands and shout, and that would be how they'd vote. Whoever was able to shout the loudest would be considered the most votes. And this would silence some of the complaints of the people not being heard. Here's another Greek word for you guys. Demos. This is masses or the people. Some of the people. These were free male native residents of Polis. They weren't noble but had some standing and wealth. So they were the ones that, at least in Athens, would be able to vote because they were men and they weren't slaves and they had a little bit of land. So I guess farmers usually. Another word, I guess this is Greek, but we're going to use this a couple of times in later chapters. The phalanx. This is the basic fighting unit of most polis. This is where each person has a shield and a spear, and they would all get together and have their shield wall and have their spears poking out. They could turtle up and be very well defended. It was very good against infantry. It was very good against arrows. It was just a really good formation. And this actually began, well, actually, I think I probably have this. Yeah, emergence of formation warfare. Each individual in a phalanx was known as a hoplite. And due to the need of a lot of soldiers, they required commoners to fight in phalanxes because most nobility were equestrians. They fought on horseback. So when you've got commoners fighting in the military, you have to give them some level of political voice because, to bring it back to more modern American history, for example, when America was sending 18-year-old boys over to die in Vietnam, but you couldn't vote until you were 21, that caused issues. And that was why the voting age was brought down to 18. Because if you can be drafted into the army to go over to Vietnam and get shot in the jungle, you should at least be able to vote for the politician that's going to send you to go over to die in the jungle in Vietnam. So that's literally been a thing forever. Well, at least since Greece, is if you're going to be made to fight, you should have some voice in your government. And again, this would be when formation warfare really became how things would go. Real quick, here we have a phalanx in fighting formation. Now, granted, this is a Macedonian phalanx. We'll talk about the Macedonians next chapter. But the Macedonians are just an extension of Rome, of Greece, so it all works together. But look at these dudes. So you've got the guys with their shields, and they've got their spears out, and everybody behind them also has their spears out. So you've got a spear tip in front of this dude that's being held by the guy way back here. Or actually, yeah, that guy right there. So you've got a guy like 5 ranks back. 5 ranks back, whose spear would be hitting anybody that's actually able to come to blows with this first guy after managing to get past all these spears. So that's a good defensive line. And also, besides that, you've got a lot more guys behind him. So that's a formation of 256 men. We're not going to worry about anything beyond the phalanx. And they had other forms. They had more formations than just a freaking box. And as I said, they could, like this, come together in a shield wall. They'd lock their shields together and stick their spears out. And you didn't want to run your horse up on that, unless you really didn't like your horse. So yeah, it was really effective. And they kind of lost that. Well, I mean, the Greeks had it for a long time, and then the Romans had, larger shields. And then after Rome fell, they kind of lost that for a while, until the Middle Ages, and then they were like, oh wait, we can just do the spear thing again. But they'd had these real long spears with much thicker like shafts, and you just stick the end of the spear in the ground and just like dare the cavalry to come at you. Because that's not going to go so well for the dude on the back of the horse. All right. So, once again, I mean, despite us looking at that map, Greece was very varied geographically, and each region had its own economy. Very different agricultural polises, despite, again, a relatively small area, like on the map. So they all grew different things. But if you were going to trade within Greece, you kind of had to be on the water. Traveling overland in Greece was a pain in the butt. It was, well, let me stop before I say it was possible. It was possible in some places. In other places, it was just too mountainous. Because in Greece, there's land you can traverse, and then there's mountains. And the mountains are just, you don't mess with them. Like today, obviously, with modern technology, there's tunnels and places you can go through the mountains. But back then, it was like the mountains were just off limits. That's why the gods lived on top of Mount Olympus, because you just couldn't go there. They didn't have to live in the clouds. They could live on the mountain because you couldn't go up the mountain. But for the most part, until we get to some of the later polis, they still really couldn't grow a lot of food until we get to, I think it's Thebes. Thebes had a lot of grain. But for the most part, they imported food from places like Egypt and the Mesopotamian region, while they exported olives, wine, silver, and large vessels, which is to say, like pots, not ships, which made them a lot of money. So again, compared to like the Dark Age Greece, where they just held on to everything they had, they were now actually trading and sending things out to the rest of the Mediterranean and becoming a decent power, and especially places like Athens really prospered from this. As early as 500 BCE, Greek polis were minting. Say printing isn't the right word. It's not paper money. Minting recognizable coins of silver, marked on both sides, which makes it harder to counterfeit. A lot of places early on would only print on one side, which was easier to counterfeit, but when you mark on both sides, that's more difficult. Let's see, Yeah, they began trading with Carthage and other powers across the Mediterranean. Again, once they began using coinage, because, hey, everybody uses coinage. It doesn't matter if you're using Greek coins or Carthaginian coins or eventually Roman coins. Silver. And again, this is something that America really took to heart when we started making our coins. You got one side that is the face of the ruler, or a ruler in case of, like when we would get to, say, Rome. And then the other side is like something going on within the state. I think this might be a chariot race. In fact, this might be a chariot race winner, and like this is the god of victory, like crowning him. Because actually, I forgot to mention, which this is more in Roman history, but like the biggest sport in Greece, and then especially in later in Rome, was chariot racing. It wasn't gladiatorial fighting. It wasn't, it was their version of NASCAR. It was chariot racing. They loved chariot racing. We think of gladiatorial fighting because, I mean, it's a blood sport, but like, no, they loved watching their chariot racing. managed to turn the mic off before that happened. Okay. So, the economy was growing, the cities were growing. What else do we have? Oh. Let's see, a water trade, coins, really the main thing here. How about culture? That's important because that's necessary for us as historians to have written language. So poetry. So as we had seen in the Greek Dark Ages, a lot of the poetry of the time was, epic, epic poems of, great heroes and really world-spanning events, which by world-spanning I mean Mediterranean-spanning events, to local poems and first-person narrative. I went on this adventure down the road. So the narrative was now more local, more personal. There were things were stable enough that teaching became a thing. That's nice. So intellectuals taught orally, spent their time speculating on humanity's place in the cosmos. Things were relatively stable, so they were able to think abstractly. So that's nice. I mean, they were able to worry about more than just surviving. And by teaching orally, I mean they walked around the city and just talked. So if you were going to try to learn from them, you had to walk behind them and listen and try to take notes without tripping over somebody. Which I, of course, have an image of because, of course, there's lots of art of these guys. We, of course, had art changing, grand stone temples to the gods as opposed to palaces to man because, again, there was more economic stability. We weren't as reliant on the aristocratic families that were the only ones who had power. Now more people had access to more money. The cities were doing better, so now they were honoring the gods. Pottery became more important. Each region had its own form of pottery. Sculpture was influenced by the Egyptians, but even as early as 600 BCE, started to have its own flair. The archaic smile, as I'm going to show you guys here in a minute, which is this sort of little half smile, which gave the piece more life. And boy, by the time we get to the end of Athens, they were doing stuff with marble that humans wouldn't be able to do with marble again until like the Renaissance, or really the Baroque era. It's wild the way art evolved over this period. So I showed you guys a little bit of Egyptian art where it's just the stock still stone, standing, which, I mean, granted, when you're carving something out of stone, you're going to try to keep it as stable as possible. You can't really get too crazy with it. So this piece, it's the statue of Frescoleia, I think might be how it's pronounced. It's a woman who, let's see, Uh, Large statue shows a young girl in a dress pulled to one side, adorned with a necklace, belt, and elaborate hairstyle, holding a lotus blossom in her right hand. Would have been originally would have been brightly painted, as I mentioned. Says that she will now never marry but remain a maiden forever, bearing the name of the gods as her marker. So, rather than the real stoic pieces we saw in we're not in Rome yet, the Egyptian statues, she's got a little smile going on, which is unique for art this old. And as we're going to see going forward, the Greeks really put a lot of effort in their art. And, I mean, it's especially the freaking Athenians, which they thought they were the pinnacle of everything anyway. All right. So, towards the end of the Archaic Age, about 500 BCE, the Greeks were becoming more alike, but also doing their best to remain independent. Because, again, they were trading. They were traveling bards and sages. You know, the Homer's epics were being passed around, reminding them that they had this shared history. And again, though, trade was going through, so everybody was getting everybody else's stuff. And while I mentioned travel was difficult, there wasn't much when it came to roads, but they could still get to each other when it came to the ocean. And some polis were much more powerful than others based on where they were geographically. So some had arable land, or etc. Athens had like all of it, because Athens was like in the perfect spot. I just want to mention again real quick, when it comes to intermixing of cultures, that's actually something that has been happening in America since basically the invention of the radio. Once people spread out across the continent, we had our little isolated regions, the accents and whatnot. But once radios, and especially television, became national, and especially with like national news networks and stuff, the strength, I should say, the extremity of accents has actually decreased, because we listen to like accent neutral news anchors, because they're specifically chosen to not have a strong accent. Because if someone in, say, New York was listening to someone from deep Alabama, they wouldn't be able to understand them, and vice versa. Now, local news stations is a little bit different. If you watch, say, something online from local, say, Louisiana, you can hear the accent. But typically, national news is very neutral. It's very neutral accent-wise. And also, like, movies and stuff tend to not have very strong accent unless it's like a period piece. So that's actually started to kind of blend the regions of America. And to a lesser extent, that's what was going on here, is all this trade and intermixing of cultures, and the sages and bards and stuff started to make the differences between the polises less different. Also, and we should definitely start this before we finish class, something that really made the differences between the cities less different was the Persian Wars. was this huge outside force coming in to conquer all of Greece. So there were two invasions of 490 and then 480 to 479 BCE. For the Persians, it was a very minor issue of expansion. For the Greeks, it was a desperate fight for their survival, well, for their way of life. And the Persians weren't going to slaughter the Greeks. They were going to just absorb them into their empire. But for the Greeks, that they may as well have been slaughtered, because the Greeks were very stubborn and wanted to continue living the way they lived, and being conquered by an empire would have been the destruction of the way of the Greeks. So the Greek polists had to work together, and that was also very different from how they did things. Sparta and Athens were now the forerunners in this, and they weren't really friendly with each other, but they kind of had to be. But like a lot of conflicts we're going to see throughout history, and especially European history, this was not a clean-cut Greeks versus Persians. A lot of polists sat out, and some of them actually went to fight with the Persians because they felt like their Greek neighbors were a bigger threat than this unknown Persian force. The devil you know, but in reverse. The devil you know is more dangerous than this new group coming in. It's sort of like what we'd see in reverse with the Europeans coming into the Americas and the natives allying with the Europeans against other native tribes rather than working with the native tribes against the Europeans, because they didn't see the Europeans as the massive threat that they were. So for example, everything we've talked about so far has been this. And here's Persia, except it goes like this way. Yeah, they just completely took Egypt with no issue. They took Phoenicia with no issue. That's why Carthage became its own thing. They took all of this, and there's Greece. There's what we've been talking about this whole time. Here's Persia. So let's discuss the Persian Empire real quick. We'll get into the first invasion next time, but I want to at least get the run up in the time we have left. So the Persian Empire, if you couldn't tell from the previous map, was the most powerful and aggressive empire, or most powerful power. Whatever. It was big. They broke away and then conquered the Assyrian Empire, conquered Lydians, Mesopotamians, Babylonians, annexed Syria and Palestine. You know, they just took everybody. Conquered all the way to India, but they didn't actually take India, so they're all the way to India. Conquered Egypt and proclaimed king, and Darius was the one who began the push into Greece. You don't need to know all of these kings. Darius is really the only one that's important right now. Now, Persian power was more absolute than what the Greeks were used to, because again, with the Greeks, it was like the most you had were some aristocrats who were in charge, and that was still like a group of dudes, or maybe oligarchs that were rich and they controlled the city. It was still like nobility that was in control, but it was a group of dudes. With the Persians, the king was considered divine, and everybody else were slaves. There was one dude on top, and everybody else was beneath him. And they were all basically dirt. So each part of the each part of the empire, the satrape was allowed its own governor. The satrap, who, again, despite being a governor and like a high-ranking official, was still basically a slave to the king, even though he had a higher position, but whatever. And due to how big Persia was, if you couldn't tell from the map, it had massive armies, with the king's personal bodyguard being about 10,000 men. Again, Greece couldn't field those kind of numbers. Greek armies tended to be a few thousand at the most. I think like the whole like, oh, Sparta only had 300 men at the Battle of Thermopylae. That was big for Sparta. Granted, the Spartans, like, 1-to-1 were stronger than pretty much any other Greek force, but numbers are going to win out. All right, I think this is the last slide I want to do before we get to the end. So the inciting incident before the actual invasion. So Lydia, this is modern day, like Turkey. Let me, actually, do I have it on the map? I do, I had the same map. So that's this area. That's over here. So again, this is like mainland Greece. And remember, all this area was settled by Greek cities. Again, not technically controlled by the city-states, but they were still Greek. That's what I'm talking about there. Okay. So these are the Lydia and Ionian Greeks. That's the coastal region there. And they were in contact with the Near East and, by extension, Persia. So Cyrus wanted to, well, again, Cyrus prior to Darius. Again, don't worry too much about the Greek kings. I get Greek. Don't worry too much about the Persian kings. So he just incorporated Lydia. He didn't even conquer it. He's just like, hey, Lydia, you're under my control now. Don't worry about it. And really, a lot of the Greeks within Lydia and Ionia were like, you know, this works out because the Persian Empire is really strong, and therefore we can use their power for ourselves. However, this meant that the Lydian and Ionian Greeks would have an imbalance of power compared to the other Greeks. So other polises attempted to interfere with this indirectly. So they tried to interfere with Greek polises who supported Darius, which is to say Athens. Athens is really bad about indirectly interfering with other polis and getting them to rise up and rebel. And then when they get in trouble, Athens is like, oh, we weren't ever there. We don't know what you're talking about. So the Ionian Greeks revolted and kicked out the Persians, and the Persian Empire, of course, would be back and begged mainland Greece for help, and mainland Greece didn't do anything, and they were quickly reincorporated back into Persia. So now we have not just the Greek city-states in Ionia being captured, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but being actually subjugated. And that's what's going to lead to the first invasion, which we'll talk about next time. So I just wanted to go ahead and lay the groundwork for Persia, for the Persian Wars, because that's like the major turning point for Greece, and that's also where we're going to lead into the next chapter. Because for the most part, when we talk about Greece, we talk about like Athens and Sparta, it's Persian Wars on. So it's this point and forward is what you think about when you think about Greece. So we'll talk about that next Monday. So I'll see you guys then.